All right, welcome everybody to our next webinar in our webinar series. This one is going to be covering how to optimize your Marketo Measure online channels. So in terms of the agenda we're going to run through today, the first thing we're going to do is meet me, and then I will take you through an introduction of Nomad. And then we'll get into understanding online channels, how to review and audit them, how to edit and update, and then of course, common pitfalls. Perfect. So to give you a quick intro into me, my name is Steph. I have been at Nomad for nearly 6 years, and I have worked in all of the major marketing automation platforms such as Marketo, HubSpot, and Pardot, as well as all of the platforms that integrate into them. So your CRMs, your data enrichment, your routing tools, all of that. And then in my free time, I really love music. I really love to cook, and I love dogs. All right, and to tell you a bit about Nomad, so Nomad is a New York City-based group of marketing operations consultants, and everyone here is trained in all of those major marketing automation platforms that I mentioned previously, as well as the CRMs and of course those third-party tools that integrate into them. So with that being said, we are going to dive into our webinar. So the first thing we're going to cover is just understanding your online channels. What are online channels? So your online channels refer to the categorization of your digital touchpoints, which we define as touchpoints that can be tracked by the measure tracking code on your site. Now, this distinction is important because there's many activities that happen online, but they might not be able to be tracked via a code that's actually on your site. So a good example of that is a webinar attendance. While that in actuality does happen online, you're on your computer, you're somebody's on your website watching your webinar, the script can't really identify that somebody has actually attended. So that's just a distinguishment between what is considered online and like what actually is able to be tracked by the script. So using that same webinar example, the online digital touch point for that would actually be the form, how they got to the form on your site where they register for the webinar, and then the attendance of that webinar would actually be an offline channel, which we won't be covering today. But that's just how we differentiate between what is an online touch point that can be tracked via the script, and then your offline, which is not able to be tracked through the script. Perfect. So how does Measure categorize and attribute online channels? So Measure will use a combination of UTM values, landing page URLs, and or referring website URLs to categorize these online channels. And this combination of UTMs, landing pages, referring URLs act as rules which allow you to roll that touch point up into a sub-channel and corresponding channel mapping. So for example, if you have a UTM for paid social LinkedIn, for example, you would use the maybe paid social medium in combination with the source of LinkedIn in order to denote that that touch point, for example, should fall into the paid social LinkedIn channel. But we will get more into how to set up those rules in just a moment. So hold tight for that. But before we get there, wanted to touch a bit on why it's essential to update your channels. And the reason being that when you get Measure, the purpose is really to get clarity on how are your channels performing and how do those channels downstream affect your pipeline and your revenue. And so when you keep your channels up to date, that allows for the most accurate data to say, okay, we can see that the paid social channel is performing really well at top of the funnel. And then we can also see on our opportunities down funnel that it's also really effective in pushing those opportunities through to closed won. So by having the most accurate and up-to-date information in order to identify what do we consider our paid social channel, that means that you're going to have the quality data that you need in order to make those business decisions that you're looking for, or that you're looking to make with Measure. Cool. So now that we know just how important it is to update our online channels, let's get into how we actually can go about editing and updating those. So for this section, we are actually going to dive into Measure itself. So you can log into Measure at apps.bizible.com, and this is actually going to pop up a screen that can contain any number of apps that may have been integrated into your admin console already. And from that login screen, you're able to navigate over to the Marketo Measure tile there. All right, once you're in that tile, this is the screen that you'll see. It will pop up what Measure calls the Discover Dashboard section, which contains many pre-built out reports for Measure and different ways to look at the data. However, we won't really be touching this section. We're going to be going into the My Account section at the top and then into the subsection for settings. And settings is really where you handle all backend configuration for Measure. So that's definitely where we'll be today to do some channel setting updates. Cool. So when thinking about editing or adding any new channels into your Measure instance, the first place you're actually going to want to go is this Create Channel section over here. And this will pop up what I like to call data dictionary, and it contains all of your channels over on the left-hand side, along with any corresponding subchannels that roll up into that main channel. You'll see that there's a pencil icon pencil and a trash can icon on the far right, which allows you to edit the subchannel here, or delete the subchannel if you no longer need it or just not relevant for that channel anymore. And then over on the left-hand side, you can see that there's another pencil icon next to the paid search channel. So if you wanted to make edits to the actual channel itself. At the bottom of this page, there's a section where you can add a whole brand new channel and then corresponding subchannels to roll into it. So the reason that we start here is pretty important because the short answer is that you're actually not able to add or edit any channels elsewhere until you have it defined in this data dictionary, which is why I like to call it that. You'll see when we get to a later part of this webinar that when you go to import any new channel rules that you have, if the channel either hasn't been defined here yet, or it's been defined, but the syntax doesn't match perfectly with the rule that you're trying to import, then it's not going to let you save. It really does enforce data quality and data management in that way, which is great for, as we said, all the importance that comes with making sure your channels are up to date and accurate. But it's important to call out here because it can cause some small hiccups later down the line. So you always start here and you can just come in here and add any new channels or subchannels or just edit existing ones right here as well. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the area where you actually add your online channel rules. So you can go ahead and navigate to the section right below where we just were, that online channels section over here, and it'll open up the screen that you're seeing in the screenshot pictured. So this should look a bit familiar because it is sort of looking like a table, which will make a lot more sense when you download these rules in a second and it opens up Excel. It'll connect all the dots that, we're really working in a table format to write these rules. So to just give a quick overview of how to look at this section, you can see that at the top of this table, we have some column headers. So starting from the left, we have a priority column. Now, what this really means is that your Marketo Measure rules are in a priority order, and it will assess them in the order that is viewed here. So it goes from top to bottom. Now, when Measure tracks a online touch point, it will evaluate that touch point and all of the corresponding data in that touch point against the rules that we have written out here. And once the first rule that it finds a match to, it will bucket into that rule. So that's where that priority order comes in. The next column is our channel section, and then the column after that is our sub-channel section. And this is where from this column, this campaign column on, is where we get into like the actual rules part of online channels. So that campaign column header, we won't be covering today. And that actually has to do with sales activities if you decide to pull those in at a later date. But what we're really going to focus on is the medium column and the source column here, where you can see that there's some custom logic for example, medium is CPC and the source is Bing. And then we can also see that landing page and referring website section where you're also able to pull in certain landing page URLs or certain referring website URLs in order to help identify, where that touch point came from and place it appropriately into a channel and sub-channel mapping. Okay, so to actually go ahead and add some new channels, we are going to want to move from the Measure platform into Excel. So at the top, you can see we have a couple buttons, and the one we really want to focus on is downloading your current rules. And this will export everything you're seeing in this view into an Excel file for us to edit. So we're going to jump into Excel in just a moment, but you will see that it's going to look something similar to the screenshot on the left. So let's go ahead and get into Excel. Perfect. So while we're in Excel, you'll see that this should really resemble what we were seeing in the Measure platform. We can see those column headers at the top with those same exact names that we were seeing in the platform. And then of course, in this case, the priority order is the row number on the left-hand side, which is pretty cool. Just put it all together. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to go ahead and add a new channel, and then we're also going to walk through how to just edit an existing one together. So say, for example, you are using Reddit as a paid social channel, then we're going to want to add that into our file here. So as we said, order does matter. So in this case, we do have a generic paid social other channel here. So I'm going to want to add that paid social Reddit channel just above it so that it correctly categorizes Reddit into the Reddit subchannel for paid social and not the other one. So that will look like just adding another row here, and we can go ahead and add paid social Reddit here. So now that we have our channel and our sub channel identified, we want to now go about adding that logic here. And so of course we have a couple of different options. We can go based off of our medium, our source, we can go off of a landing page or a referring website. But really when it comes to channel categorization, it is more foolproof to go off of your UTM values, especially if you have a strong UTM structure. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and do that. So I will put in the UTM structure we have for paid social Reddit, which is just a paid-social for the medium and the source being Reddit. So we've successfully gone ahead and added our paid social Reddit channel. We've grouped it in the priority order with our other paid channels because, if we're paying for something, we definitely want that to be near the top of our rule logic so that paid stuff does get correctly categorized. And then we also did place it just above the generic paid social other channel we have. And so that's how we can make sure that it's, again, categorizing appropriately. And then while we're in here, say we want to edit an existing channel. So I can see here that we have our paid social LinkedIn, and the logic that we're pulling in is for LinkedIn paid. But, say that for whatever reason, we're noticing in our data that the referring website isn't always pulling in, or sometimes it's not categorizing it as expected, and we want to just get another row of logic in there. So we can go ahead and add in another line for paid social LinkedIn. And this is where we will also want to use our UTM structure for paid-social and then LinkedIn here. So you're definitely not limited to just one row of logic per channel. If you have many different ways of categorizing a specific channel and sub-channel, then you can add as many rows as you need here. So like we're seeing for paid social LinkedIn in rows 8 and 9. Now, with that being said, we can go ahead and save our rules and import them back into Measure. Okay, so now that we're back in Measure, we can go ahead and import our rules. So you'll notice that button on the top right that says Upload CSV, and that's where you can click and just import those rules that we just updated. Now, it will ask you to save again, like once you've uploaded, it'll kind of make sure that you confirm that you want to save. And there's really one main reason for this, and that's because it will lock you out of any updates for 7 days once you go ahead and import that CSV and you hit save. And the reason for this is actually a very good reason, and it has to do with the fact that Bizible never really deletes or misses specific touch points, even if you don't have that channel defined. So it's not as if it's searching for the existence of these rules to then find touch points that match it. It's rather the reverse. It captures touch points and then looks for which channels it falls into. And so what that really means is once you're saving your rules, Measure will recategorize every single touch point that you have, or look to recategorize every single touch point you have against that new logic you put in. So potentially you had some of those paid social LinkedIn's touch points with that new UTM structure we put into the file falling into maybe an other or a direct channel. And once you save that, these new rules, Measure will evaluate all the whole data set and identify if there's any touch points that match that mapping and need to be moved around. So that 7 days really allows for Measure to work through the whole data set and move some things around. And that's why it kind of locks the system down for 7 days. So you'll go ahead and upload. If there's no issues with syntax, then you'll be prompted to save it, and then you can go ahead and save these, and you'll be locked in for 7 days. So next up, we want to talk about how do we review and audit these online channels now. So when you're thinking about reviewing touch points, the best place to do this is actually going into the data set, which lives in your CRM instance. And that could be either Salesforce or Dynamics. Now, the reason we recommend going into your CRM is because the Discover Dashboard section, which we loosely talked about early on, does have pre-built dashboards for you in the Measure platform. However, those pre-built dashboards, as suggest, are pre-built and very structured, and you are not able to really drill down into specific touch points to see like what's the underlying logic that rolled up, and you don't have a good way of really auditing your channels in the platform itself. So doing it in your CRM will make your life much easier, and it'll also allow you to then drill down into like the specific leader contact or opportunity that it was associated to. So while we can't jump into either of those platforms right now, we can talk about what that report would look like and what you'd be looking for in that report. So the report should be based on the objects Bizible persons with Bizible touch points and grouped by Bizible person ID, which is a bit of a mouthful. So to break down what those objects are, the Bizible person object is that connector between leads and contacts in your CRM. So oftentimes those are living separately, and it's really hard to get them in one reporting view. You usually have to pull a report to look at either one or the other. Now, Measure, or formerly Bizible, as you can see by this naming convention, is really useful in the way that they marry those two objects together under the Bizible person object. So we're going to be looking at Bizible persons with Bizible touch points. Now, the Bizible touch point object is related to people, versus there's a Bizible attribution touch point object, which is related to opportunities. We won't be covering that today, so just focusing on the touch point object. This is, again, those touch points related to the person. So, if I'm on the Nomad site and I fill out a form, you're going to see my Bizible person being Steph in the data set with a Bizible touch point that's associated to me that contains all of that information that the measure script was able to capture in that visit that I had. And then when we talk about grouping by Bizible person ID, this is just the unique identifier of the Bizible person, and it's really just a long way of saying email address. So you're basically grouping that report by email address so that you can see all of the different corresponding touch points that relate to that person. So in this example that we're speaking about, where maybe I'm on the Nomad site, but maybe that wasn't my first touch, and potentially my first touch was from a paid social LinkedIn campaign where I converted on a form, and you'll be able to see that touch point. You'll also be able to see my additional form fill touch point from being on the site today. So that's just a straightforward way to look at your entire touch point data set and start to look at how touch points relate to people and really get a feeling for what this all looks like. Now, to get a little bit less granular and not look at the person, but to look at the channel, if you want to identify miscategorized channels in Measure, the best way to do this is to use a report that's built on those similar objects that we just mentioned, but change the grouping from Bizible person ID being email address to instead the grouping being by channel. And so what this will look like is it will group all of the touch points per channel together, and you can look at it in a visualization and see high level how many touch points are coming in per channel, which channels have the most touch points, and which ones also have not a lot of touch points, because that's almost always more telling. We see this a lot sometimes with maybe a paid search or a paid social. Sometimes those get miscategorized into other channels earlier on, and that's where editing and updating your channels really comes into play. So having that grouping on the data set allows you a high level to see, do these numbers gut check make sense? And if they don't, then you can dive into them. So if you do want to dive into them more, that's where you can add an additional grouping for medium and source. And that way you can easily see, I have my channel for paid social. Now I'd expect to see in the medium grouping only paid social mediums, and all of the sources should relate to paid social. So being your LinkedIn, your Facebook, such like that. And that's a really good way to, at a glance, be able to understand if your UTMs are appropriately tagged to your channels. All right, so lastly, we just want to cover some common pitfalls and best practices. So some common pitfalls as you're using your online channels is inconsistent UTM tagging. We've talked a lot of this webinar about the importance of UTMs, even in identifying your channels. And when your UTMs aren't consistent across either teams or departments or even platforms, then that's where you're going to see it be a bit harder to write those rules that we need to write to map people into those channels. So having a really strong and consistent UTM tagging system is really important when utilizing Measure. Another common pitfall we see is just incorrect channel mapping rules. And so this could be where maybe there's an extra space or there's an extra hyphen somewhere in your logic, and we're going to see that the channel mapping is just like incorrectly categorized. So we also want to be mindful of that, and especially QAing your work as you're importing the data. Another common pitfall that we actually see a lot is not reviewing your direct and other channels. These are those catch-all channels that are at the bottom of the online rules, and they will sweep up any of those touch points that haven't found a home or a channel in any of the previous rule sets. So something that we definitely recommend is, as you're auditing and reviewing your channels, looking into specifically the direct and other channels to look at what mediums, sources, landing pages, referring URLs are being pulled into that. And that usually opens up opportunity to create new channels or edit your existing ones like we talked about earlier. Which of course leads us to the most common pitfall we see, which is a lack of regular audits. Measure is a very, very powerful platform, and there's so much value that you can get from it. And However, there's also so much that changes in marketing day to day. There's, new vendors that you're working with, and suddenly you have new mediums and new sources that are incorporated. And we want to make sure that those are incorporated into your data sets, that they're also incorporated into your reporting later down the line. So by doing regular audits, you can make sure that there's no new channels that need to be added, or maybe that there's old channels that you want to get rid of, and that you're really staying in touch and on top of all the information coming in. Which leads us to our best practices, which should be no surprise at this point, but the best practices are standardizing your channel definitions. So making sure everyone's aware of what it means when you have a paid social channel versus a webinar channel versus a content syndication channel. We should also be implementing and leveraging consistent UTM parameters, and then reviewing and auditing our channels regularly. All right, congratulations. We have successfully made it through our webinar on how to optimize your Marketo Measure online channels. If you are really interested in additional Measure support, then you can reach out to us by filling out our contact form at nomadmarketing.com/contact. Or you additionally, if you just have questions, want to chat, have some burning questions about the platform, you can also email us at sales@nomadmptg.com, and one of our consultants, maybe even me, will respond and be able to help out. So thank you so much, and I'll see you for the next one.